This is our agenda. First, we'll present the justification of the problem, then the theoretical and methodological frameworks. We'll present our context and participants, our research question, objectives of the study, our results and self-recommendations, and finally, our conclusions as our second steps. Why did we do collaborative reflective teaching? In May of 2021, several cities in Colombia experienced a widespread series of massive protests, mainly sparked by a proposed tax reform by former Minister of Finance, Alberto Carrasquilla. Several faculties at the university voted to enter into strike in solidarity with the unfolding protests, an unprecedented event at this private university. That same week, University Rector Alejandro Gaviria called upon professors of the university to convert their classrooms into ad hoc spaces of dialogue, following the principles and values within the mission of the university also, and in order to address the unprecedented waves of protest and government response sweeping the country. Something that is a practice already well established in the public education sector. Several English teachers at the Department of Languages and Culture heeded this call, but given the lack of precedent at the university for implicit or explicit limits and freedoms with regard to such politically sensitive conversations, teachers were left to their own devices in determining what content to address and how to address it. The objective is to use these findings to initiate an ongoing conversation with peers regarding best institutional and pedagogical practices for discussing these difficult topics in class, bringing individual practice out of the shadows of the private classroom also, and into the light of solid academic discourse where it can be improved and shared for the benefit of the department. Based on Murray, this collaborative reflective teaching project aims to revisit the practice of two English teachers during the Paro Nacional, Emilia's and mine, with the objective of identifying shared challenges, solutions, ongoing tensions and opportunities with regard to discussing politically sensitive topics in a context where this hasn't been the norm. Emilia.
Thanks. So our theoretical framework, we take an insider perspective because we are insiders to our department and we want to improve our own practice and that of the department. We will be focusing on this through the lens of a culture of peace and the 3 dimensions of peace education as put forth by Amado, and through the lens of critical pedagogy because it is education for social justice and sort of addressing the larger reality outside our classrooms. The context and participants, so it's at the Universidad de los Andes Languages and Culture Department. There are 2 participants, Ana Milena and myself, and it is after the paro, so we are reflecting in hindsight on what we did during that time in courses, in carrera courses that were B1, B2 on the separate scale. So our research question basically was, what are our strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities in addressing politically difficult topics in EFL class based on our teaching practice during the Paro Nacional?
Okay, so to try to answer this question, we adapted an instrument proposed by Murray. As a first step, individually, we identified our concerns, listed solutions and actors who provided solutions, either students and or professor, and then we self-reflected on what we'd do differently next time. After that, together in collaboration, we asked questions and made comments on one another's practice, and we found our best practices together so that we could list lessons learned from this exercise. So our objectives were to identify our personal and departmental strengths, weaknesses, obstacles, and opportunities in addressing politically sensitive topics in EFL class, make public our private practice, and also to initiate a community of practitioners. These results, the ones that we have here, are like a very big summary of what we found in our discussions. These results turned into the form of self-recommendations. So if we want to improve our collective capacity to discuss these sensitive topics in the class, we should incorporate some of these aspects. The first one is content and language, which we call dimension. That's like the first aspect we found. A socio-effective dimension, and also an administrative dimension. And also a considerable amount of groundwork needs to be undertaken by all the actors involved in this idea. I would say that a culture of peace in which we make values and principles visible would be like the biggest thing. The definition of critical thinking also, a more democratic academic culture, and some others that we can give you more information about. Let's look at them more in detail. Content and language. Based on our theoretical framework, Amado outlines 3 approaches used in peace education. The first approach, based on content, focuses primarily on historical memory and the documentation and recognition of human rights abuses, the causes of social unrest, the origins of social issues, and also crimes. And for that, we should go deeper into this context and categorize language features. For example, grammar structures frequently used, vocabulary and lexical items to understand different shades of meaning, and underlying messages that are that appear in different types of texts. These features are used to better analyze this context within a bigger framework of critical thinking. Also, we should research appropriate content to be studied and integrated into, let's say, to the target language, content and language together. Identify also colleagues to determine this relevant content and language, and also identify administrators that are better suited to identify again opportunities of learning to make decisions. That is like our first dimension. Let's look at the other one.
Right. So we also realized that we need to address the socio-effective dimension of discussing politically difficult topics in class, because it is emotionally and psychologically much different than discussing modal verbs, for example. So we identified that we would recommend the first co-creating a community agreement with your students. A community agreement outlines the do's and don'ts of how we're going to conduct all of our conversations. It's recommended to start with 3 sort of rules or norms and invite students to add additional ones. So the 3 basic rules are that we agree to all speak in I statements, we commit to believing the best of one another, and what is said here stays here, and will not gossip about one another's views outside of class. The second thing we should do is set objectives for any dialogue or conversation and make these explicitly known to students. Our default thinking is often to assume that the objective of a dialogue is to convince the other of our viewpoint, but setting an objective such as understand one another's fears or validate one another's concerns can help redirect a conversation from implicitly bellicose to explicitly aimed at building community or tolerance. We should also share the literature. If we, as teachers, read about a culture of peace, we should invite students to read about it as well, so that they can better understand the objectives of the curriculum and can help co-create the processes of dialogue. We should let students share anonymously or in groups and get their consent if they're going to share publicly. students or teachers, anybody might reveal vulnerable things. We might reveal vulnerable things about ourselves in these topics. And as teachers, we need to provide the appropriate sort of space for that kind of sharing. We should also democratize speaking time so that no one student or teacher dominates a conversation. This can be done with appropriately scaffolded speaking and writing activities where students get an allotted time, and this cannot be ceded to others. We should also focus on understanding, not necessarily on opinions. As human beings, we often produce opinions defensively and without understanding, and focusing instead on really understanding a topic rather than sharing reactive opinions about it can help lower everyone's defenses and keep us teachable and focused on the content that Ana Milena mentioned. In addition, we, teachers and students, should also work to develop socio-effective tools that can help us deal with difficult emotions brought on by these tense topics. In addition, we identified some administrative dimensions that we think should be addressed in order to more successfully and robustly address these difficult topics. And one thing is to consult our colleagues to learn about their concerns and contributions to addressing politically sensitive topics. So this process has to be horizontal and include everyone, also as stipulated through the framework of a culture of peace. We should also involve administration and establish support for any additional steps that we want to take in regard to addressing difficult topics in class. Particularly if we don't have these things, teachers often feel maybe uncertain and alone in the classroom of not knowing where the boundaries of the conversation really are and the implicit expectations of the department. Going forth, we should probably also create spaces of professional development for teachers who are interested in addressing politically sensitive topics in the classroom through the lens of peace education. And possibly create a standard operating procedures for difficult topics, and these should be created transversally as part of the English program. So our efforts to address the reality around us should not have to be piecemeal, but rather more systematic and transversal.
As a result of our teaching practice and experience, we can identify some essential ideas to make our university students and ourselves aware about what conflict means and how to deal with conflict. This is what we call groundwork. First, the positive attitude towards, because conflicts are present in everyday context. Where there's life, there's conflict. So conflicts have to be embraced as ways to understand how human beings interact, saying that individuals consider values and principles as foundations of self-respect, self-esteem, autonomy. Second, an analytical attitude and better development of critical thinking skills to differentiate inner dilemmas from conflict with others. That is not the same. And maybe the origin of that controversy. And from that controversy, we can define values of solidarity, empathy, and others. And third, a transformative attitude to go beyond, as well as to transform conflict to grow individually and as a community. In that sense, students and teachers cultivate diverse abilities necessary for conflict resolution. Let's say tolerance, resilience, the capacity to cooperate, negotiate, making decisions under conciliation, and also under uncertainty. Building a culture of peace will make citizens act in an environment of justice, respect, and liberty, following those principles of solidarity and inclusion, something that we think is a transversal curricular access, so that culture develops as well as consistent attitudes towards human rights. We consider that this is not only an isolated action for a particular topic, this time was the Paro Nacional, but in another situation, that would be something that is a broader vision of education. That would be something that is transformative for a transformative academic culture that involves every sector in society. We can start from the department and the university. Emilia.
So as we looked at our results, we had the realization that our self-recommendations take time to implement, and it's almost as if we are creating a new sort of, or reaching for a new sort of academic culture. And then we turned to the literature and found that the UNESCO's culture of peace is a sort of academic, social and academic framework that could fit really well with the approach that we would like to propose for addressing these topics. So on a social level, we can see here that a culture of violence, which is perhaps the status quo of a lot of societies, equates power with force, whereas in a culture of peace, promotes active nonviolence. In a culture of violence, people are mobilized in order to defeat an enemy, but within a culture of peace, we're mobilized to build understanding, tolerance, and solidarity. Instead of vertical power, we would emphasize a democratic process. Instead of secrecy and propaganda, we would promote a free flow of information. Instead of armament, disarmament. Instead of a male-dominant society, we promote power sharing and nurturing and decision-making. And instead of exploitation of people and the environment, we would focus on human rights and sustainable development. So that's on a social level. Now, let's bring this more to the classroom. So this quote, "A culture of peace is a set of values, attitudes, and behaviors that promote interactions based on liberty, justice, democracy, tolerance, and solidarity. It rejects violence and seeks to prevent conflict and its causes. It seeks to solve conflict through dialogue and negotiation, and to guarantee rights for all people while guaranteeing their participation in the development of their own societies." A culture of peace is a process that, like Ana Milena said, does not reject conflicts, but views these as engines of social transformations. Conflict exists whether we address them or not, so might as well address them as an engine of social transformation. And in addition, we see that in the culture of the 21st century continues to reject conflicts because it understands them as generators of violence and not as engines of development. It's for this reason that an educational approach that abandons the spirit of resignation and inertia is urgently needed in order to take a firm leap toward critical thinking regarding the reality of society. And particularly if we are in a department that hasn't had, there's not a lot of precedent for addressing conflicts. Perhaps there has been a sort of conflict shy precedent where this framework of a culture of peace could be a very fruitful way to turn towards conflict and address it in the classroom.
How we can connect this culture of peace with our missions. Actually, we have a lot of things to say from what we found in our missions. Last week, Raquel Bernal, our current rector, expressed and reinforced the importance of our mission and why to put these interdisciplinary values and principles into practice. That our students should be true democratic citizens by exercising principles of pluralism, respect for ideas, and awareness of local and global issues for the sake of social development and transformation. We see these values and principles present in our missions. For example, the mission statement of the School of Social Sciences, as well as the one of the Department of Languages and Culture, align with the same commitments. A critical and ethical education, awareness of social responsibilities, critical thinking skills, cultural sensitivity, and the promotion, dissemination, and solution of social problems. We can see that we have a path that is already there. How we connect this with the rest of our activities inside the classroom is what call us next.
So as Ana Milena mentioned, in a way, because of the mission statements of our departments and universities, we already, we have a path to take. We may need to define those further, like what it means in the classroom. But also our second step that we propose now after our first steps is to reach out to our colleagues and initiate or broaden the transversal dialogue about how to address this in class. So our justification is that we need multiple voices for validity and for the democratic process that the cultural peace promotes. Our research question for our next step is what are professors' attitudes for addressing conflict within a cultural peace framework? We would be addressing Unyande's language professors through an anonymous survey. And our objective is to identify opportunities for and obstacles to effectively addressing politically sensitive topics in class as a much broader community of practitioners. So thank you very much. These are our references, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Emilia and Ana Milena, for sharing this valuable classroom experience on how to include politically sensitive topics in the EFL classroom while building a culture of peace. So now we are going to move on to questions, and I see a hand. Constanza, please go ahead.
Gracias. And gracias, Ana and Emilia, for your presentation. Very, very interesting. I'm curious about two things at two different levels. One is if you can give us a little bit of a flavor as to what happened in your classes during the semester. I mean, I understand that what you're doing is working from your reflections on what was happening and how you were reacting to it. But it would be, especially for those of us seeing this horror from a distance, wanting to get a flavor of what happened there. And importantly, you know, what were the reactions of your students? What was happening in your classroom? And pedagogically, what were you doing to sort of, I don't know, change readings that you were doing or changing, you know, the topic of the lesson to address something that was happening out in the street. So probably, you know, a little bit of curiosity as to how this was happening in your classrooms and what were the reactions of your students who, if I understand, if it is classes from Carrera, is because there will be English majors, correct? Or languages majors who will probably eventually become teachers. So how do they see themselves also addressing those things in the future? Thank you.
Ana Milena, do you want to start?
Okay, we were using different types of text, basically the ones that social media gave us. We worked on different news. Some of them were from really recognized sources like El Espectador, El Tiempo, and others were sources from, let's say, from the New York Times. They needed to look at the information that was represented there and try to see some features of the language. Since we were in grammar 2, in a grammar course, we wanted to analyze what the language features were, and we paid attention to specific things that happen basically for news. For example, passive voices, how they express ideas into passive voice, for example, and how they omit agents when they want to erase or delete responsible people, let's say. So one of the things that we already checked there was the language, and then they needed to research more about, for example, if the police needed to have a reform. They needed to look for reliable sources, including the Constitution of Colombia, the Police Code of Conduct, official documentation issued by the government, some other newspapers. And based on certain questions, they needed to actually understand if the police and the actions that the police were committing at that time, because they were not supposedly official, for them to discuss, to give opinions about that. Let's say if the structure of the police was really well formed, like who controls the police, the main mission of them, if they are militarized or not, their responsibilities as a body, as an official body, their training they get, the profile of a police officer. So all those things were like the topics we reflected upon, and we tried to have some ideas. They really found this interesting because they knew they needed to investigate before, instead of just giving opinions, because critical thinking is not just giving opinions about a topic, but to try to have different sources and differentiate what they believe with some other information that is around.
Right, and I would say in my class, we focused a lot on, instead of what do you think, what's your opinion, what do you know, what do you not know, what scares you, what would you like to understand also as a way to release kind of attachment to ideas and attachment to being us versus them, and these, not that our beliefs and our values are illegitimate. Of course they are, and we're not inviting students to not have those. But to sort of, I felt that a lot of the students were psychologically and emotionally exhausted every time. And I think everyone of us who has lived through any kind of episodes of social unrest knows that it's extremely draining for anybody who's paying even a little bit of attention. So in a way, it was a lot of also socio-effective skills to address these issues, not necessarily from like, what is your opinion, and support your opinion, but from other, like a softening of our positions in order to try to humanize one another a bit.
Okay.
Gracias.
Thanks a lot. There is a comment on the chat. It says, great idea. I look forward to hearing more. Well, I have to run off for work. I'll be in touch. And that is Angela Bailey. All right. Are there any more questions? No? Okay. Okay, then thank you so much, Ana Milena and Emilia. Very good. Okay, so we're going to move on. Okay. All right, so now joining us from Durham University, I would like to introduce Kaoru Umezawa. Her research interests are teaching Japanese, public speaking in foreign language, and phonetics. The title of her presentation is World Speech Day Japan, Making the Online Bilingual Speech Event an Accessible and Rich Cultural Learning Experience. Okay, so welcome, Kaoru.
Thank you. Is the screen share working? Or
yeah, could you please, probably now? Yes, now it's fine.
Is it
perfect?
Do you see my PowerPoint?
Yes, yes, we do.
Okay. Or now do you see, sorry, because I have two screens.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if I'm showing the slideshow or I'm showing the non-slideshow.
Okay, I can see right now a PowerPoint presentation with the title of your presentation.
Yes, but is it in the slideshow mode or is it in a?
Well, I can see all the slides. I can see all the slides right now. Yes, even the smaller slides.
So that's the, sorry, I have to.
That's okay, don't worry.
Oh, sorry. Okay, I think I will have to, oops, just a moment. I think I have to move this here. I'm not very high tech, I'm afraid. Sorry about that.
Don't worry.
Okay, so I think now I can.
Okay, now we see a blue screen. Now, yes, fine. I think that now we can see it. Excellent.
Okay, thank you.
Laura, that's okay. Go ahead. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, so the benefit of learning public speaking in foreign language teaching are widely recognized. Many educational institutions around the world organize speech contests in foreign languages, and participation in such event is considered to be an excellent learning opportunity for learners. The aim of public speaking is to communicate one's ideas and message to an audience, and learning to speak effectively in foreign language can be a challenging but rewarding experience. However, there are not many speech contests that provide sufficient opportunities to do so. As Nomura 2009 states, a number of considerations needs to be taken into account in order to make the speech contest more than just a competition, but a valuable learning experience for all participants. It is not only the competition itself that influences learning, but also the whole process of preparation before the competition and reflection afterwards. In addition, it is often only a handful of learners who are confident enough to take part in such event. So many learners feel anxious, to have public speaking anxiety about public speaking and are reluctant to take part in contests because they feel that they are not good enough. This is unfortunate because only through experience can we learn and become good at what we do. And why do we think that we are not good enough? It is because we think it is just a competition, and if we don't win, it is meaningless. There are absolute standards according to which the judges decide who is better than others. If one isn't chosen, one will believe not to be good enough. In reality, however, every message is unique, important, and worth sharing. By experimenting with how best to deliver each message, participants can learn a lot about the topic, about themselves, and about different ways of looking at the topic. By sharing their messages in the form of speeches, they can learn a lot from each other. World Speech Day Japan is part of World Speech Day, a day when the power of speech is celebrated around the world. This event is used to make speech contest more accessible, focusing on one's preparation and reflection rather than the competition itself. It is also an international bilingual speech event, with students from Japanese universities and secondary school giving speeches in English, and Japanese language learners from the UK and elsewhere giving speeches in Japanese. Through peer learning, the participants will help each other to create a speech. Each person will be creating a speech in a foreign language. Being able to give feedback about their native language helps participants to feel more confident and have a sense of self-efficacy. Through active feedback sessions, they can also build a good sense of community and learn about each other's language and culture in an open and curious way. This type of learning is in line with mediation and plurilingual and pluricultural competence described in CFR. The language level of participants varies. Some are quite advanced, others at beginner's level. However, throughout the workshop, they soon realize that they are not simply dealing with the language as a communication tool. In other words, in order to truly communicate, it is not enough to just convey words and meanings. You need to convey messages that are understood as the speaker intended them, and this leads to mutual understanding. Unlike artificial intelligence, our human brains individually developed by the various experiences we've had in our lives. And what we picture in our minds when we hear the same word, tree, may not be exactly the same for different people. It is therefore not easy, if at all possible, to understand a person's message exactly as he or she intended it to be understood. But when it's between different languages, things get even more complicated. Thus, what the participants have to face and learn through the bilingual speech exchange is more complex and makes them think deeply about what it is to communicate through speech. Through the post-competition reflection and questionnaires this year, 3 main issues were identified as being difficult by the participants to balance when considering what constitutes a good speech. Number 1, being honest with and true to yourself versus trying to comply with the expectation of the audience. The result of questionnaire and post-competition reflection showed that many of the participants this year agreed that sincerity is one of the most important elements for a good speech or effective speech. In speech communication, there are 3 pillars that identified as essential for speakers to appeal and persuade the audience: logos, pathos, and ethos. Sincerity, the element selected as important by the participant, is in line with trustworthiness, that is a subcategory of one of the 3 pillars, ethos. As public speaking is communication consisting of a speaker, a message, and an audience, it cannot be achieved simply by the speakers imposing a one-sided message. The awareness of an audience is an important factor for a speech to be successful, and participants were reminded of this many times during the preparation workshop of this event. It has also been highlighted that it is important to give a speech that is personal in your words without trying to talk in big words. Empathy is defined as the imaginary participation in another person's experience, including emotional and intellectual dimensions, by imagining his or her perspective. In this case, the matter is more complex because the language used, as I said, in the speech is not only one's mother tongue, and the audience is a mix of native speakers of one's own language and native speakers of the target language. So audience is mixed. The participant had faced a dilemma that is how truthful and sincere they should be to themselves and to the topic, while making the story more interesting to the audience. By nature, public speaking has an element of showing, acting, and performing. But how much should you act and how much should you reveal about yourself? There may not be a clear answer, but it has been useful to think, discuss, and reflect on this issue. It is also important to have empathy for others, for example, by guessing their feelings. This issue is related to plurilingual and cultural competence and the fact that participants have noticed and discussed this matter helps to develop their competence. Number 2, delivering a speech in a target language the way you would normally deliver it in your own language, or copying the way a native speaker of a target language would deliver it. This is mainly about non-verbal element, gestures and facial expressions and so on. First of all, in English education in Japan, due to the influence of English supremacy, there may be a tendency to aim to speak English with gestures a native English speakers would use. On the other hand, in the UK and elsewhere, studying Japanese and therefore giving a speech in Japanese may still have an exotic or special image. Many people feel that they are learning a special language that not so many people have learned before. So they may choose to give a speech in Japanese while retaining their identity as a native English speaker rather than speaking in a Japanese way. The rhetorical speech of persuading others with one's point of view originates from Western speech rhetoric and is mainly taught through English education in Japan. As Ishii 2013 points out, the ideology of the English education industry is based on the worship of Anglo-American society and culture. In Japanese education, one is not so much taught to argue one's point of view and persuade others. Rather, it is traditionally considered a virtue not to impose one's own opinion and to be considerate of the feeling of those around you and of others. We should be careful not to stereotype and avoid discussing cultures in a dualistic way. But the Western type of rhetoric speech was not introduced until the Meiji era in late 19th century. Before that, and since the Heian period, the rhetoric of waka, traditional Japanese poem, Buddhist sermon, ancient Japanese ethical and moral rhetoric, the rakugo, performing art of funny storytelling, the mainstream of the traditional Japanese storytelling were the rhetorical styles presented in Japan. These are little different from Western style speeches, which aim to persuade the audience by stating logically one's own opinion directly. During the reflective discussion, several participants raised questions about how to put the right amount of emotion into their speech in the right way. Among the three pillars mentioned above, pathos is the emotional appeal to the audience. This might be done by speaking in such a way as to evoke an emotional response and does not necessarily require speaking emotionally. However, sometimes adding emotion in the voice and in how you express yourself can help the audience empathize with the experience you are sharing with them. Japanese participants in particular said they found adding emotion to their speech difficult, and that this also largely depended on the topic. If the theme is a serious one, such as, for example, suicide or a legal matter, they were unsure of how to be expressive when giving the speech. There may be cultural difference in this too. In Japan, the cultural tendency is to keep one's emotions unexpressed in public places and to moderate one's words and actions so that not to cause friction with others. It can be said that emotion is universal to some extent, but it is also influenced by culture. According to Lim, culture constrains how emotions are felt and expressed in a given cultural context. It shapes the ways people should feel in certain situations and the ways people should express their emotions. In a large number of studies, some aspects of emotion has been shown to be culturally different because emotion is not only biologically determined, but also influenced by environment and social or cultural situations. The study indicated that Western individualist culture high arousal emotion like happiness or excitement are valued and promoted more than low arousal emotion, but it is vice versa in Eastern or collective culture. The cultural difference in the way emotion is expressed and perceived can also influence the way people construct and deliver speeches. This aspect needs to be taken into consideration, especially when giving a speech in a foreign language, and when the audience is a mix of native speaker of one's own language and the native speaker of the target language. In addition, nonverbal elements such as eye contact, facial expression, gestures, and so on are not the same in different cultures. Again, participants are faced with the dilemma whether to adapt the body language accompanying their speech to the standard of the target language or to the form that feels natural to them when they speak in their native language. As I mentioned earlier, due to the way the English language is taught and how public speech is developed in Japan, and indeed the fact that public speaking is not deeply rooted in the Japanese culture, when Japanese participants give speeches in English, they might feel it more appropriate to imitate the way English native speakers would speak, rather than trying to adapt their English speeches so that it is delivered in the way they would speak in Japanese. One well-known and accessible model is TEDx, where people can walk around on stage as they speak, looking at decolonizing perspective. I'm not sure if this is a good thing, but this can be looked at further. Number 3, consideration of the different connotation of topic in different cultures. We may need to take into account that there are cultural differences, not only in the way you speak, but also in the way you feel about and interpret the topic of your speech. For example, there was a participant who wanted to talk about the way the media portrays women's body image, saying that a certain view on positive body image is imposed upon us, and because of that, Japanese women tend to be too skinny. However, the positive body image may vary according to different cultures. Depending on the audience's background, the understanding of the topic can be different, and this can influence which speech they think they will consider to be good. According to Sakurai, when comparing English and Japanese TED Talks on the same topic, the structure of the speeches differs according to the language and culture. The way the speakers associate with an audience is different. The American speaker leads the audience like leader, while the Japanese speakers shares the process of constructing his or her talk and act like the audience's partner. What is expected in an English speech may be different from what is expected in Japanese speech. So after the event, participants continued to be motivated and engaged in a number of activities. So 6 participants continued to participate in the next year's World Speech Day Japan as a mentor. 3 participants visited Toastmasters Club and presented their speech to receive more feedback. 1 participant decided to study speech more seriously and joined the club. So World Speech Day Japan is aimed to enhance the learner's experience and accessibility to the speech event by preparing for speeches through bilingual peer learning and reflective discussion after the event. Participants have access to a great deal of learning opportunities. For future, I would like to continue to review judging method and criteria. I didn't have time to talk about this, but in this presentation, but it is difficult to judge the speech. We also discussed about this by a single set of criteria, where someone pointed out that good melon is different from good lemon. The criteria for good lemon. So criteria for good lemon has to be sour, but criteria for good melon is sweet. So we felt like there's no single set of criteria, so we didn't use a set of fixed criteria. We didn't present it from the beginning when we did the peer feedback. So they didn't form the speech according to the fixed set of criteria. But there are lots of issues to maybe more to look into this. So this is something I want to look into more in future. And also from next year, we're having mentors, and not only the participants, how the mentor will grow and learn from the experience. I think it's interesting to observe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Kaoru. Now, I would like to know if there are any questions. Okay, so I see that Emilia has a question. Please, go ahead, Emilia.
Hi, thank you, Paola, and thank you, Kaoru. I was interested also about what the mentors, maybe you mentioned a bit, but could you comment on what so you mentioned the mentors' growth in the future, but if you could comment about this past set of mentors, what do the mentors know before they become mentors, or what must the mentors know about these speech structures in order to be prepared to be mentors?
Oh, we haven't started a mentoring system until this year. We are going to start preparing for 2022. The mentors are the ones who are participants in the World Speech Day this year in March. So they're very enthusiastic. So we didn't have this mentoring system, but they wanted to get involved, continued to get involved as an organizer side. So we kind of introduced the mentoring system. And because we have this everything on Zoom online, we meet for the first time online with the students in Japan and students in other parts of the world. The kind of relationship we have is sort of fragile. So we had a huge interest because of the COVID and not being able to go study abroad. So lots of students initially registered, but as the workshop progressed, we had, had a more small compact, but they were very, very enthusiastic. But we thought that mentor can help to kind of support when some participants are not so sure about the event, because they are more about the same age, they had experience last year, so they could more individually support than the teachers like us. So that's how I introduced mentor. So we will see how it goes.
Great, good luck. It sounds like a good idea for the new participants and for the old participants also.
Thank you.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Okay, Constanza, please, go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you, Kaoru. Very, very interesting. I more than a question, I have probably a comment to share, because here in New Zealand, we have a similar issue, but it goes even to higher stakes at school level, because the national assessment regime expects all students to submit speeches. And the teachers of Japanese have raised this issue that you're raising here so interestingly, that, the concept of speech that comes, for example, same as debate, comes from a strong Anglo tradition, translated to other languages is just really interculturally impossible and not desirable. So very interesting to hear this example that you're bringing here, because it is very similar. And I don't know how much of you guys would have something similar with assessment being high stakes, expecting students to draw on genres that are not legitimate in the target language.
Yes, it's interesting because I was watching some, maybe it's not directly relevant, but I was watching some Toastmasters clubs speech, how do you say, speech event on YouTube. And Toastmasters Japan, they are very active, and Japanese people who are practicing speech in English, but also they have Japanese version as well. And I was watching both and comparing. And because also, it's also to do with the fact that we are doing it online. It is very different. The use of camera, you know, if you are standing on the stage, it is one thing, and then like TEDx. But if you're doing it in front of the camera, it's a different thing. And there were lots of new attempts. And one of the actually participants in World Speech Day Japan, he had spoken about hearing, hard to hear people awareness. And he wanted to raise the awareness because it's not a visible kind of symptom. You know, they have how is it visible. So they wanted to raise the awareness how it is. So he started with muting the sound, and he started to make a speech, and he did kind of act like, and he explained this is the world we have, and that was quite effective. So the use of technology or digital, how do you say, technology can be effective, and some people also come close to the, adjust this distance with the camera. But also somebody I saw in Japanese Toastmasters Club speech, they were doing it like rakugo performance, which I mentioned a little bit, like a bit of comedy. I think they talk like one person talk like take a role like acting two people, for example, and they go like, oh, how is it like, and then this next person is go like this, and so it was, I was wondering if that is a speech, because it was more like acting, performing, but it's very close to rakugo performance in Japan. So I was just wondering, maybe we might also, by decolonizing point of view, we might look at developing a speech in a different way, more, based on our individual culture. But I don't know if it's possible at all. Yes, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. There is a comment here on the chat by Marianne Arribas Tomé, and it says, just a comment, very interesting topic and material for the context of translation studies, something I will consider with my students. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. All right, so we're going to move on to our next presentation. And I just need a moment. All right, and that's right here. Okay, all right, very good. So, well, finally, I would like to welcome Constanza Tolosa from University of Auckland and Diego Navarro from the School of Languages and Cultures, Victoria University of Wellington. Constanza's research interests are intercultural language teaching, and Diego's research interests are intercultural communication and language learning. The name of their presentation is A Global Citizenship Education Initiative and the Fostering of Intercultural Competence in Schools in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So welcome, Constanza and Diego.
Hola, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great, thank you. I'll be doing the presentation today. Constanza is going to be here and hopefully maybe field some questions at the end. So I will get started. I'll share my screen, sorry. Can you see this?
Yes, now we can.
Okay, fantastic, thank you. Well, I'll begin now. Mihiana kia koto katoa ko Diego toku ingoa. Herawe te tutaki kia koto katoa. And we are very grateful to have you here for this presentation we put together. And I'm zooming in, as you said, from Wellington, and my colleague Constanza is in Auckland, and it's 9 in the morning. So it's quite different from where you all are, I guess. So yeah, just another quick introduction. My name is Diego Navarro, and I work for the School of Languages and Cultures at the University of Wellington. And my colleague Constanza is a senior lecturer at the University of Auckland. In today's talk, we're going to describe our project, which is called the Cultures and Languages in the Classroom project, which we ran last year and wrapped up this year. And we'll show how it carries some key characteristics of global citizenship education, and also how it was able to foster in our participants intercultural competence. A few points about global citizenship education. It is, after reading a lot about it, notoriously difficult to define. Different wide range of understandings of this subject or practice, and very much depends on the region that's researching what it is, the geographical region, which I think reflects a kind of difference in how different nations across the world are understanding globalization and their role in an ever interconnecting world. So the way different countries see their role in the global community does impact how they define global citizenship education. So the contextual nature of global citizenship education is a very key consideration when you're studying it. And also as a concept, I guess, there are types of global citizenship education, or GCE. At the extremes, we have a kind of a cosmopolitan view of GCE, which is quite surface level. And on the other extreme, there is an advocacy GCE, which pushes more social justice type of an angle on this type of education. Another way to distinguish it is for a soft GCE, which is generally what gets taught, versus more critical GCE. So a lot of the research on global citizenship education critiques it for not being critical enough, which is something we've been trying to consider. The discourse and practice around global citizenship education reflects, I guess, the larger internationalization of curricula across educational sectors. However, research on internationalization specifically is concentrated mostly at the tertiary sector. And where in the school curricula, similar research that has similar aims and similar ideologies falls under what's called global citizenship education. So there is a difference slightly in the terminology around internationalization, that's more for university, and global citizenship education, which is at the school level. But it's all basically a response to globalization and the world's heightened interconnectivity. It's also important to note that debate around GCE is very much connected to broader discussions in education around citizenship education, which is really where this all started from. Global citizenship education research tends to focus on three main micro sectors, which is on teachers, on students, and on curricula and on learning material. A few things to note: very, very few applied studies have been conducted on global citizenship education. This might be because it remains quite an ambiguous concept and very difficult to define. So for the purpose of our work, we draw on the UNESCO definition and understanding of global citizenship education as a pedagogy that aims to empower learners of all ages to assume active roles, both locally and globally, which I think is quite important, in building a more peaceful, tolerant, and inclusive societies. UNESCO breaks down these into three domains of learning: cognitive, socio-emotional, and behavioral. Cognitive dimension of global citizenship education looks at the knowledge and thinking skills that are necessary to better understand the world and its complexities. The socio-emotional dimension looks at values, attitudes, and skills, enabling learners to develop effectively and physically and to help them live together respectfully and peacefully. So there's a kind of general theme of social cohesion and kind of understanding and flexibility with difference that drives through these definitions of, or UNESCO's definitions of global citizenship education. But they still remain quite broad and quite difficult to see in action. Okay, so now moving on, I'll talk a little bit about the complexity of the local context, looking at languages and cultures in schools in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and some of the challenges we faced in adopting, and what the nation, some of the challenges the country faces in adopting global citizenship. So if you look at this picture that was adapted from Waite in 1992, it shows the kind of changing and ever increasing complexity and diversification culturally and linguistically of the country. We can see English as the de facto dominant language that they use. There are two official languages, Maori and New Zealand Sign Language, which are actually official. And then there are languages other than English, Maori, and Sign, and there's also English as a second or other language, which breaks down. We have community languages, New Zealand Sign Language, again, which is official. We have a very, very large Pacifica community who have been here historically for a long time. Samoan community in particular. I think Samoan is one of the top 3 most spoken and used languages in the country. And then Chinese, Gujarati, Afrikaans, Dutch. And then in international foreign languages, we have Latin and Greek, and some of the more traditional French, Japanese, German, Spanish, and Chinese. That so all of these languages are kind of in competition with each other, or sometimes supporting each other. Ironically, and which is policy per se. So although people have been fighting for an official languages policy for a long time, there's not much movement on that other than, you know, the fact that we have Maori and Sign Language as official languages. Okay. So the curriculum, another challenge in adopting GCE in New Zealand is the curriculum and navigating the New Zealand curriculum, which was developed in response to this rather broad statement. What is important for learners to learn in the 21st century? Even more broad is the fact that the implementation of the New Zealand curriculum rests on the decisions of individual schools and their teachers who define the educational priorities for the communities. So each school decides what's important for them to learn and to teach. And so that is quite challenging because there isn't anything really that schools have to do except kind of interpret the curriculum the way they see fit for their community and where they are. The new national curriculum, which was introduced, I think, in 2007, fortunately now includes a new learning area called learning languages, which it didn't originally include, but there was some controversy over that, and they decided to introduce a learning languages dimension. And this new learning area separated the learning of a second language, or an L2, from the learning of the first language. And this gave a greater profile and greater status to learning of a second language. From 2010, about 12 years ago, 11 years ago, students in years 7 to 10, which are about 11 to 14 years old, were given an entitlement to learn an L2, which brings us to the next point, which is that basically we're arguing that learning languages area of the New Zealand curriculum is an ideal way of weaving global citizenship education into the school curricula. However, there are considerable issues. As an area of the curriculum, learning languages is unfortunately not compulsory. It's more of an expectation that the students are introduced to a different language and culture, but again, it's not compulsory. This therefore gives it a very low priority compared to other learning areas. There still remains a strong commitment for English-only assimilatory attitudes, but the changing landscape and thanks to immigration, that seems to be shifting slightly. People are much more, or at least, at the attitude level, opening up to difference of language and culture. Another challenge is, as you've seen from that model before I showed, all of the languages are in competition with each other, which is sometimes challenging. And there's a massive shortage of qualified teachers of languages in primary, mostly, and intermediate. In secondary is a little different, but primary, there is definitely a shortage of qualified languages teachers. Statistics show an increase of languages being offered. So we have more languages being offered and a greater variety of languages being offered than ever, but the numbers are, attrition rates are quite high. Students are not either not enrolling or dropping out quite quickly when they start languages. And there's a very, very strong tension between the teaching of international languages and the place of Te Reo Māori, which is the official indigenous language, and Tikanga Māori, which is the culture of Māori. So those are some of the challenges that we have with finding ways to weave global citizenship education into the New Zealand curriculum. So one way that the New Zealand government has sought to globalize education in Aotearoa is by establishing what they call Centers for Asia Pacific Excellence, or CAPES. There are 3 CAPES, 3 centers: a Latin American CAPE, North Asian CAPE, and a Southeast Asian CAPE. They each have different directors and different specific aims, but the overarching goals of these centers is to enhance New Zealanders' capacity and competence in working and interacting with the Asia Pacific region. CAPES work closely with tertiary institutions, so universities across New Zealand, with different external stakeholders on a variety of endeavors, which spread across their focus spreads across education, languages and cultures, for example, which we'll talk about. But there's a very strong focus on business and trade. And the CAPE that we worked for this project was the Latin American CAPE, which has specific goals that are you can see on this slide. It's interesting to note in this CAPE discourse, you can see around the CAPE discourse around what they're trying to achieve are common tensions that we also see in general global citizenship debate between which research has identified as either ideological needs and pragmatic needs. The pragmatic needs of global citizenship education are more in line with the neoliberal conceptions of education. So they promote competition and really focused on economic growth, versus the ideological needs of GCE, which promote a more holistic social justice aligned views, which look to foster, I guess, more empathetic, equitable global consciousness. So the CAPES try to kind of walk the line between growing and competing in the business area, but also in seeing the relevance and value of cultures and languages. So that's what we see in global citizenship education in the schools and in the curriculum across the research, but we're also seeing that in the discourse around these centers for Asia Pacific excellence in New Zealand. The next bit, I will unpack a little bit of intercultural competence. It's we argue that our global citizenship education work was able to develop this important competence in our participants. So I think it's important that we kind of look at what it is that we think it means. Intercultural competence, the way we look at it, sits within the area of intercultural communication, which itself brings an interactive framework to the study of culture. So intercultural communication is looking how people communicate across cultures. The many understandings of intercultural competence have centered on things like adaptability and effectiveness in communicating messages in unfamiliar cultural contexts. The broader conceptions of intercultural competence refer to traits, knowledge, and behaviors related to one's interactions in any intercultural situation or context. Oftentimes, it used to be that this was strictly where someone was abroad or outside of their local context, but now, as we're seeing more diversity in language and culture in the local context, it's also possible to develop and use and draw on these skills at home. Byram makes an important distinction between intercultural competence and intercultural communicative competence. As you can see in the first one, intercultural competence are the skills and abilities or the competence that people draw on to interact effectively in their first language with people from another culture. Whereas intercultural communicative competence are the skills and abilities or competence that people draw on to interact effectively across cultures while using a second language. So it's quite an important distinction. And in this research, we didn't observe the students interacting in the second language. We didn't record observations of the students interacting in the second language, so we can't really speak to the communicative competence. We can speak just to the intercultural competence, how they interacted in their first language and talked about other cultures. So the interesting points here is that we'll see things like first language and second language coming into play, but also first culture and second culture become issues that are worth considering when you're looking at the dynamics of the interaction. Okay. Now we'll move on describe our cultures and languages in the classroom project. It was a highly collaborative project. We worked across CAPES, across universities. So the University of Wellington teamed up with the University of Auckland, and within each university, we also worked across faculties and schools. So the School of Education worked with the School of Languages and Cultures here in Wellington, but most significant collaboration was with the actual schools. The project design drew on a range of research, which highlights the challenges in resourcing languages and cultures in schools. So we looked at research that looked at attitudes, language acquisition, language maintenance, pedagogy, and policy in New Zealand. And we tried to address some of those challenges with the construction and design of this project. And we appreciated very much that the fact that New Zealand context is unique, bicultural and multilingual, officially and de facto a super diverse nation. And this is impacting classrooms and learner needs greatly. The Ministry of Education figures were also incorporated, pointing to some problematic year groups, which is what we decided to target the year 7 to 9, because this is where the expectation for them to learn languages is quite high, but at the same time, we don't have subject area specific teachers at that age group. And then they go into secondary school and they'll have to start choosing languages. So this is why we targeted that age group. Oops, sorry, we're moving on quickly. Okay. Some of the project aims. The first aim looks at professional development for the teachers. The second aim was looking to give our assistants. We hired recruited advanced tertiary students from the languages and cultures programs at university to work as assistants with teachers in their schools. And we wanted to give them an opportunity to kind of use their language and culture as much as knowledge of culture in the classroom. But the third one was we wanted to provide the school students themselves the opportunity to develop intercultural competence and language proficiency. So, oops, sorry. We recruited these advanced students of Spanish who'd been learning Spanish. They were New Zealand background, but learning Spanish in university. And then we put them in schools in Auckland and Wellington. They worked for 1 hour a week, generally for 6 to 10 weeks. And they were guided by our experts in education and helping kind of develop materials and resources to take into the class, to take these languages and cultures into the class to help teachers. For the research, for this part of the project, I'm only going to look at the data from our participants, our assistants, which are the university students, and the actual students in class. We also have data from teachers. Data was collected post-project quite quickly after. We asked them to come in focus groups. We had reflective focus groups. And then we transcribed and translated all of the interviews. And with this is what the data that we use to start looking at suggestions or indications of the development or the fostering of intercultural competence. So with our assistants, you can see they start talking about when they describe their roles and responsibilities, they touched on various topics that related to other cultures and their own, and suggesting, I guess, the beginning, we started to see the fostering of intercultural communication, and they talked about how it's important for them to teach the culture of other cultures. The assistants became a lot more engaged, and their kind of worldview and cultural views started to grow and deepen as it related to different regions. That was quite useful. A lot of them thought they knew quite a bit about Latin America or Spanish, but in this project, they had to delve in quite a bit deeper. And they did a lot of kind of reflection too on their own culture and themselves and their own experiences, which is what we wanted them to draw on and think about. Kind of an intercultural criticality about themselves and others. And then the students got an opportunity to learn another language and another culture. And while they were doing that, we asked them often to kind of compare and think back and reflect on their own, I guess, local culture and their own experience with language. You can see from this student here, he said they could learn about their own natural language as well. This person said he was 30% Maori. And so we often, when we introduce new languages and cultures, are asking them at the same time to think about how their own language and culture works as a step in developing the intercultural communication. So just to wrap up really quick, There are a host of, I guess, issues in trying to introduce global citizenship into schools. And research has argued that the development of intercultural competence requires a holistic transformation or change in mindset that's beyond the process of learning an additional language. But we argue that the complex interplay of GCE initiatives in a multicultural and a multilingual formal L2 learning context is in fact transformational. There are a few things that are more transformational than learning another language, essentially is what we're saying. And this is the ideal way for people or schools interested in introducing GCE into the curriculum. The ideal way would be through language study. Okay, sorry about that. It took a little longer.
That's
But I'm
okay,
done.
Diego. Thank you so
Yep.
much for your insights on global citizenship education. So I would like to know if there are any questions. Do we have any questions or any comments from the audience? Okay. Well, I don't really see any questions, but I have one.
Okay.
So you have mentioned that, well, that New Zealand is very unique, but I would like to know, how does Aotearoa compare to other cities and regions in New Zealand, for example, in relation to these challenges that you mentioned, like the curriculum, so.
Danza, you want to take it?
Well, thank you. Well, the challenges are a lot because, as Diego said, the fact that it's not compulsory means that the schools do whatever they want. And what we were trying to see was to pilot an initiative where we could demonstrate that even a short term of exposure to, in this case, Spanish, but it allegedly could be any other of the foreign languages, will actually foster at least a start of that awareness about the others. And the other contextual factor that is important here is that the classrooms themselves are very multicultural here. So, you know, it's not only learning about the cultures that speak Spanish, which are many, as we know, but also learning about themselves and their peers and what they bring to the classroom. So that was something that we wanted to look at quite carefully. And, you know, we do have a lot of look at that data from the students based on interviews. As Diego said, we didn't observe the lessons themselves, but based on the interviews, that were quite enlightening to see students who had not thought about these issues, you know, spark conversations and discussions about what was that. And the second thing that we wanted to pilot was, since there aren't enough teachers to teach Spanish at that level, what about using the resources of students who are learning at university level, you know, advanced students of Spanish, who were interested in actually doing that. And more than the language itself, what was very interesting for us to observe was how those language assistants actually started to see the cultures that they knew about Latin America through different eyes in presenting them to these younger kids. So those were some of the things that, you know, the system is very complex, but we sort of try to simplify certain things and say, look, there might be a model that will actually address some of these, you know, challenging contextual issues that is worth looking into.
Okay, thanks a lot, Constanza. And actually, there is a comment on the chat, and it says,
yeah, so
Constanza,
that, Emilia,
yes, what has been said, exactly. So I don't know if there's maybe something else that you would like to add.
No, I think you know, the model of institutions working collaboratively was quite interesting to be a part of, because again, it's not very common that you know, universities like to collaborate with each other. So the CAPE, you know, the funding of the CAPE allow us to do those things. There were a lot of limitations and, you know, challenges that we had to overcome, especially bureaucracies of our universities. But the spirit of the project was very strong, and the you know, the schools were very, very happy with what was happening. The big question mark is sustainability, because those efforts, you know, move on very quickly, and unless the institutions keep them, nothing will happen there. So that's unfortunate, because some of those students will probably not, you know, continue with the language.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you so much for your presentation today, and thank you so much to all the presenters. I think that the breakout rooms are going to close now. So you have a very good day. Goodbye.
Thank
Thanks
you.
a lot.
Bye.
Bye.
Paul?